Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you very much on behalf of Friedrich Ebert Foundation and, of course, New Equality. We are cooperating on this one, which is the first event in a new series, which we are just starting this year, on the economic development of Hungary in the European context. During this series, we are trying to analyze a bit more in depth on which trajectories the European economies are, the leading ones and the so-called peripheral and semi-peripheral ones and relevant value chains. Secondly, how did or will the corona effects change previous predictions and forecasts? And thirdly, of course, what about Hungary in particular in this context? Is there something like a middle income trap to be addressed, and how is there something maybe like particular urbanomics at play? And if so, what does that mean for the economic and social future of Hungary? And of course, as always in FES workshops and conferences, we will be particularly interested in which policy options are really available. I believe there couldn't be a better analyst to start this series with than the author of Urbanomics. That's the title of a small publication that Gábor Scheiring wrote for FES last year. And in this publication, he gave a clear yes to the question that I remember a bit more than a year ago was already subject of a debate at the Kossuth Club in those days, when we could still meet, where the question was raised: was there a particular maybe unorthodox Hungarian or urban way of economic management and development? If I may quote two sentences from the Urbanomics publication of Gábor Scheiring of June 2020, he said, and I quote, "Urbanomics is an answer to the crisis of the post-1990 liberal dependent economic model. It aims to boost the creation of wealth and capital accumulation, targeting the upper middle class, national capital, and transnational corporations in the export sectors. However," he continued, "Urbanomics fails to improve the productivity of domestic businesses and undermine long-term development potentials. It is a polarizing socio-economic strategy requiring authoritarian fixes to stabilize power." These were the takeaways from last year's publication. And I believe this last sentence brings us directly to the title of Gábor Scheiring's new book on the authoritarian capitalism and the accumulative state, which will be discussed today with the help of a very interesting panel and as usual in this series, under the very able moderation of Zoltán Pogačar. I wish all of us an extremely interesting evening. I'm sure we are going to get a lot of insights. And Zoltán, you are taking it from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jörg, for this introduction. And the name of New Equality magazine, I am the editor-in-chief of New Equality magazine. In the name of New Equality magazine, I'd like to thank Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for the long cooperation that we've had. We've been cooperating for years now, and this is a new series. So I'm very excited to kick off an English language series, as Jörg has already mentioned, this semester. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd just like to share a few technical information with you. Basically, we'll be talking here for about an hour, and then the audience gets a chance to ask questions and make comments. But as we speak, you have an opportunity to comment and ask questions in the chat box. So if you go down to the bottom of your screen, there's a chat box. If you write us a couple of comments or questions, we'll try to include it in the discussion. There's also a participants link at the bottom If you find yourself, you can put your hand up there. So if you want to ask a question directly after we've spoken, you can do that by raising your hand in that participants box. Ha nem beszélnek angolul, és ezt most angolul hallják, akkor lent az interpretationnél a japánt kell megtalálni, sajnos magyar nincs a rendszerben, ezért japánra kell kattintani, az a magyar fordítás. This was just about interpretation into Hungarian, those of us who don't speak English. I think I've pretty much said everything that I wanted to in terms of technical information. This is being recorded, so that's something else I have to share with you. So it's now being shared online in English, and it's being recorded, and we'll be sharing it in Hungarian later on with the voice of the Hungarian translators. That's all the technical information, and without further ado, I'd just like to introduce the panelists. Gábor Scheiring, the author of the book, has already been introduced. I just want to mention a couple of things about him. Those of you who are Hungarian will surely know that he was an MP in Hungary before for LMP and then for Párbeszéd. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge, and now he is a research fellow at Bocconi University in Italy, and he's also an editor of New Equality magazine. There's a lot more that could be said about him, but to save some time, I stop there. And the panelists will be, in the order of appearance, Kristina Schőreg, who's an economist at the University of Malaga. Thank you very much, Kristina, for accepting to speak today.
Thank you very much.
And then next up will be Don Kalb, who's a social anthropologist from the University of Bergen. Thank you, Don, for accepting our invitation.
Pleasure.
And last but not least will be Dorottya Sikra from this institution that was formerly known as the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Thank you very much, Dorottya, for accepting to speak today as well.
Happy to be here.
And she's a social policy expert. Now, that's the introductions. I really don't want to waste much time because I'm sure you're here to listen to Gábor and the panelists. So first up, Gábor, I'd like to ask you to summarize your book a little bit. You have about, let's say, 15 minutes to give us an overview. I mean, many of us have obviously read your book, but there are many obviously in the audience who are yet to read it. Can you please give us a kind of brief overview from what it is that you have written? Over to you, Gábor.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity, for organizing, and for the panelists for joining this amazing event and this great opportunity to discuss my research. So I will try to be brief, and I'll have 5 points to summarize the book. And the first point is about not what I'm saying, but what I think are insufficient or sometimes wrong explanations out there that are sometimes are dominant explanations. So the topic of the book is the collapse of democracy, the retreat of liberal democracy in Hungary. Hungary, a country that has been, until the first half of the 2000s, celebrated as perhaps the most successful transition country with high levels of economic liberalization and high levels of political liberalization, and was very frequently portrayed as an example for other countries to follow. And then, as we all know, in 2010, Viktor Orbán took power with qualified majority and completely restructured the political and economic landscape of the country. And I think this not only took politicians and activists by surprise, but also analysts who were presenting this linear success narrative about Hungary. And I think that this is related also to two insufficient explanations, insufficient or wrong explanations of what has happened after 2010. So the first is about culture. And I think culture is hugely important. Both, I pay special attention to it in the book, also in terms of hegemony and hegemonic culture. But when culture is framed as an alternative explanation to economic processes, then I think it's wrong. And it's especially wrong when it's framed in the usual elitist discourse that we all know from Eastern Europe too well, which basically says, in the context of Hungary, that Hungarians only get what they basically deserve. This is a feudal country. It has always been a feudal country culturally. There's serf mentality. People are just not educated enough, and people are just not mature enough for functioning democracy. They are divided, polarized. So it's this kind of illiberalism what people value most. So this is just to summarize very briefly the argument. And I think this is as I said, elitist, and also misses the point because right until the end of the 2000s, majority of Hungarians, actually the highest share in Eastern Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, supported liberal values and liberal institutions. So there was no demand for a politically liberal turn, for a retreat of liberal democracy. It's very important to see, and I cite all kinds of data on this in the book that I don't want to get into the details. But of course, as I said, culture is an important part of the story. So, but it's in itself insufficient, but wrong if interpreted as an alternative to economic failures. And a second alternative explanation out there, and very frequently encountered alternative, is about politics, or political rogues, as I call them in the book. So this is about basically everything was going well, but then these nasty politicians, they messed up the things, and especially the Viktor Orbán, who changed from a liberal politician to an authoritarian conservative politician, and he's responsible for everything. And everything is about Viktor Orbán, and analysis should be also about Viktor Orbán. And of course, it would be a big mistake to deny the role of Orbán and the role of politics. And I will also briefly talk about how I see his role particularly. But again, it's wrong to frame this as an alternative to economic problems. And politicians never operate in a social vacuum. And there's a scarcity of decent research on how the social context really frames and influences and shapes and limits political opportunities for politicians. So this is the starting line, these insufficient explanations. And I think there are three processes that are crucial. So the second point that I want to make is that globalization matters to understanding what has happened to Hungary. And as Jörg presented the summary of the paper that I wrote to Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, I think the post-2010 regime in Hungary is a potential, not the only potential, but one potential political response to the tensions of dependent integration into global capitalist economy. So without analyzing these tensions of Hungary's particular way of integrating into the global economy, we won't understand what has happened. And in the book, I show this double disintegration that took place in Hungary in terms of social disintegration, which also polarized workers, middle classes, and upper classes culturally, and an economic polarization that polarized domestic and international capitalists. And this is rooted in the process of globalization. But as I argue in the book, these economic processes never predetermine what is going to take place. So this is one potential answer that Orbán is giving to these tensions. But there could have been, I think, other answers. And this is the more hopeful aspect of the book. So you have these serious problems emanating from the structure of the global economy, but then states and local politics can have better answers than the ones were provided in Hungary. My third point is that class matters. And it's, again, hugely important, especially in Eastern Europe. Also in Western Europe, social sciences have abandoned the concept of class largely, not all, and thanks to them. One of them is Don, who has contributed greatly to our understanding of class in a relational matter that combines culture and economy and politics. And in my book, I show how class can be applied to understand what was taking place in Hungary. Now, as I've said in the case of globalization, I see it in the same way in the case of class, that these class processes are not completely determined by the division of labor, by globalization, by capitalism, but these are changing relations that emerge between different positions. But it's very important to see that these different positions within the division of labor are crucial. And Hungary, as most other countries, is a class-based society with growing class inequalities. And these class inequalities are hugely important to understand political outcomes. And there are 2+1 classes that I pay special attention in the book, and also the internal divisions between those classes is what I call the working class in the book, how the industrialization and political neglect led to a rising neo-nationalism among workers, as their economic grievances were not addressed. There was no other progressive language, there was no class-based language among workers. So nationalism emerged as their dominant way of narrating their status loss during a transition. And this other class that I'm analyzing is the business class, and in particular the tensions between international capitalists and domestic capitalists. So the dominant class coalition that institutionalized what I call in the book the competition state after state socialism in the 90s in Hungary was transnational capital and technocratic managers in alliance mostly with liberal politicians, mostly on the left, but also the right participated in this, like when Fidesz was in power in 98 and 2002. But the policies, economic and social policies, all favored the capital accumulation of foreign investors, and was designed in a way to attract even more and more foreign investment to the country. And this generated a disillusionment and a growing anger among national capitalists who revolted also against this order. And I analyzed it in depth in the book how this is crucial. And the third is that politics also matters. So there were these changing class relations, the rising class tensions, and it's Viktor Orbán who took the opportunity to reorganize the dominant power bloc. And politics matters in three ways, and I show it in the book, is policy failures. So the lack of sufficient management of social tensions and the lack of a developmental state to avoid or at least reduce economic dualism between 1990 and 2010. The second is the deafness, the political deafness of the left to the economic anger of workers. And the third is the clever way in which Viktor Orbán reorganized hegemony and basically emancipated domestic capitalists and invited them basically into the dominant power bloc, but didn't kick transnational capital out. So it's national politicians, national capital, and transnational corporations that formed the power bloc after 2010 in Hungary. And the result is an authoritarian capitalism and an accumulative state that, as Jörg summarized, and I analyze it in depth in the last chapter of the book, is not a developmental state. So it fails to reduce the productivity differences between transnational and domestic capital. And in fact, it erodes those capacities that would be needed for long-term development. such as education, such as innovation capacities, and most importantly, the bureaucratic capacities of the state. They are completely subjugated to the logic of the dominant power bloc, politicians, but also the economic elites. And it creates huge social tensions. So there's a massive redistribution upwards to the political class, to national and transnational capital, and growing wealth and income inequalities. And these inequalities are managed by authoritarian fixes. Institutional authoritarianism is basically tilting the playing field in favor of Fidesz, and the kind of authoritarian populism that I briefly described also in the last chapter, which is basically designed to reframe these social and economic tensions in cultural conflicts and generate new moral and cultural hierarchies so as to divide the losers and attract some of the working class voters still into the orbit of this dominant power coalition. So very briefly, this is the summary of the book.
Thank you very much, Gábor. I think you've done well with your time, and I hope, I'm pretty sure you've made a lot of people curious enough to read the book, those people in the audience who haven't yet. I think the value of your book is that you give a completely different narrative from the mainstream narratives that have existed so far, both the right-wing narrative and the liberal narrative. But now it's over to the participants, the panelists. At first, I'd like to ask Kristina, you've read the book, you've read Gábor's paper on Orbanomics. As an economist, how does this look to you? The way Gábor describes the economic model, which is prevalent in Hungary today, how does it look to you? Over to you.
Thank you for the question. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. So among the first things I have to tell that this book is an amazing job, a really precise field study about a country that might be interesting even for those people who are really not having too much information about Hungary. We're talking about a small and open economy that is really integrated into the regional special features, and a lot of interesting tendencies are happening these years in Hungary. So I have to say that Gábor was able to describe the situation from a very precise and objective way. The way he presents all the data available, all his empirical and qualitative research, it's an amazing job. And I think that all his findings, all the graphs, all the figures, they are just easily understandable for those people who are even not that close to the numbers and to the economic tendencies. However, if you would love to understand more about the special features of such an economy in Central and Eastern Europe, it's definitely a book to understand a lot more things than just the topic of democracy. We may be finding some really good suggestions and answers about the economic development, and I'm talking about the long-term economic development and the way it is connecting to the democracy question and as well as the dependency, because we might definitely claim that Central and Eastern Europe is a very special region that definitely has this historical burden. This is what I might say, especially in case of Hungary, to develop such a strong economic dependency, primarily on the FDI, as well as some other special features, which are also described in the book. I have to say that this approach of the accumulative state is a really valid interpretation of Hungary's economic background, because it is just shedding light on the dual structure of the economy. Why is Hungary having a dual structure? Why is that a problem, you may ask? We have to say that Hungary is typically that country which is having a relatively incompetent national capital related sector. So the domestic sector has never been able to perform at a high level on global terms, because who are these days the main competitors of Hungary? We may say that, for example, besides our little region Latin American countries, as well as Southeast Asian economies. These are our main competitors. And on the other hand, we may say that Hungary is struggling with the problem of transnational and multinational companies, because they are also really attracted to the region due to some favorable conditions, for example, related to the taxes. And in such case, we may definitely find a conclusion or come to a conclusion that if this economic model is not being changed to another perspective, and if a country is not able to contribute, for example, for export activity with high value added production, high quality human capital, a really well-functioning educational sector to keep those people who are having all those high skills within the borders of the economy, its dependency is going to proceed in the future. And Gábor has successfully demonstrated all these findings with empirical data, as well as all those interviews and other case studies that he is providing in his book. I would also highlight another important thing. When we're talking about Hungary, we may never forget about the thing that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was a really intense crisis period that lasted for about 5 years. And my personal opinion is that this historical burden is still in the air in Hungary, in case of Hungary. So because capitalism was done without capitalists, as it is indicated. And well, it might sound a bit blurry. However, the country at that moment was economically definitely not ready for implementing a model that was in some way a desirable one. And people, all the economic actors over the years became really disillusioned, and not just with certain features that are related to the country, but definitely they were disillusioned with capitalism as well. Because, well, if a small and open economy is receiving an external economic shock of any nature, and if it's maintaining this high economic dependency, this protractedness is going to be a much more solid process. Why? There is another really interesting phenomenon that has been mentioned at the beginning of the introduction. It is called the middle income trap. And Hungary, according to many, many resources, is definitely has experienced, or even these days might be experiencing, a middle income trap. What does that mean? That the economy is practically not able to catch up to a higher level of income. There is a protracted stagnation, and for some reason, the country is just not able to converge to some other economies. Let's not talk about the European Union, but just about the Central and Eastern European smaller region. Why are we not there? Even if having a look at the Visegrad economies, why is Hungary falling behind? The answers might be found in the book, and I think that Gábor is definitely providing us some really good interpretation of the problem. Again, the lack of high-skilled human capital, the too intense presence of the multinational companies, and also the government's constant actions to push to the background the economically rational decisions are really not working in the favor of Hungary is becoming much more competitive, if not even at the global level, but at least within our economic region. However, for finding some other proof, you just definitely have to have a look at the book, because even if just talking about all those international rankings from the point of economics, there is a solid evidence that Hungary has been falling behind since 2010. And Gábor is just approaching this problem even from the perspective of income inequality, certain economic indicators, not just the GDP, because it's definitely not enough to evaluate a country, but certain other parameters which are just showing the signs that a country that used to be a very beneficious spectator of the access to the European Union is these days lagging behind even the Visegrad economies. And according to my personal findings, we might also say that in certain economic indicators, Hungary is rather closer to certain Balkan states in our region. So it is definitely a challenge to be able to, either from the economic, political, and social aspects, to find a solution that would provide such a small and open economy the chance to converge to some, if not center, but rather more developed economies, and to maintain sustainable economic development in the next couple of years.
Thank you very much, Christina. Lots of stuff there. I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about this in the discussion. Now it's over to Don. And Don, Gábor mentioned you as being one exception to the general rule of social sciences forgetting about class. You're somebody who is interested in class. So how does the book look to you from this perspective and from any other perspective that you'd like to discuss the book from? Don, over to you.
Very good, thank you very much. Enormous compliment to Gábor. This is a phenomenal book. Gábor started out by saying that experts around 2010, 2011 were all completely surprised, shocked by what was happening in Hungary and the immediate, very fast turnaround from a liberal model that was seen as a success globally to what was going to be an illiberal model, an authoritarian model. Well, I was not surprised. And because I was interested in class and I was thinking along class lines and also critiquing the way we had come to think about class, including the social democratic way. Now, reformist, technocratic, all brought down to a set of factors that you can manipulate on a dashboard via the national state. Class is more complex than that. I have been writing about class, and since the late 1990s, I was working on Eastern Europe. I think first time I wrote about the possibility of neo-nationalism becoming a dominant force politically was in 1999. And that was not because there were a couple of parties at that moment in time screaming loudly. These were completely different actors than Orban and Kaczynski that came up later. So I sort of anticipated this, and it was all scripted in the failure to deal with the class issue. Now, so I've been teaching at CEU for a long while. I'm not at the CEU anymore. I'm in the richest country in Europe these days, Norway. But one thing I learned as an anthropologist, so I'm really talking as an anthropologist now rather than a political economist. Sultan wanted me to talk as a political economist. I will do that too, but I think it's good to start as an anthropologist here. When I was talking in 2005, 2010 even, about Eastern Europe being a poor region, I can remember a class with quite a few Ukrainians. And so I picked out Western Ukraine as a good example. I knew they were coming from Western Ukraine. I said, Western Ukraine, very, very poor population. And people would be very angry. They did not like to hear that because they were well-schooled, well-civilized, middle classes in their own eyes, even though average income at that point in time in Western Ukraine was perhaps 170 euros a month per household. And they did not think they were poor. Tell that a Latin American peasant or a Filipino peasant, right? They would say, I'm poor. But in Eastern Europe, those who imagined themselves to be against the socialist heritage, to have actually become middle class over time. And all of them remembered that they were not middle class before socialism. Socialism was a massive middle class formation. Well, all those people were very, very reluctant to face the actual political, economic realities and the cultural realities that they were confronted with. I also remember a session, it must have been around 2010, where a bunch of Polish sociologists presented photographs that they had been making of the Katowice area. And this was all about complete destitution, right? So streets, houses, complete destitution. And they told us in that session, rather emotionally, that each time they had been showing this stuff in Poland, they had been punished by the public. Nobody wanted to know. Well, the combination of that poverty and that abandonment, exploitation too, and experts and elites not wanting to know is what produced the neo-nationalist populist backlash, because it had to be known. At some time, it had to be discussed, put on the table. Hungary had the really nice figure of the 1.5 million jobs that disappeared between 1992 and 1994. It took them more than 10 years. It took you more than 10 years. It's okay? It took you more than 10 years to actually put that on the table, that 1.5 million jobs had just disappeared like that. And at the moment that you put it on the table, the ghosts were not manageable anymore, right? The political discussion really went out of the curve, and radicalization was happening in a right-wing way. Now, what is so great about Gábor's work is that he is working very explicitly from the very beginning. The introduction about his father and his mother is moving and analytically important. It's about talking about class from the very beginning. And he shows, and of course he embraces the way I and others have been starting to talk about class, a relational class concept, which is holistic, which is also cultural, which is very experiential, which is emplaced. It is also about places going down, being abandoned. It's about disinvestment, etc. It's about health, right? And it was very important for Gábor's work anyhow. It's about education, it's about social services, etc., etc. So in that holistic relational sense, Gábor starts out immediately and develops on that basis a critique of all the liberal critiques of the rise of illiberal authoritarian politics in Hungary, as well as in Central Europe. Now, it is very important, I think, that this sort of, let's call it cultural political economy perspective is being posed against the liberal perspective. So yes, so this is not just a mafia state. Yes, it is not just populist politicians or demagogues taking their chance and pummeling the public, putting themselves into power, misleading everybody. And it is not, of course, as Gábor also said, it is not a liberal culture historically, right? A lack of democratic civic sensitivities. He attacks those things fantastically, and I think the alternative that he builds chapter after chapter is extremely convincing. I don't think it is done anywhere in Eastern Europe, but perhaps also not in Western Europe and the US, as well as Gábor is doing this. So in fact, what he does, and I say this with a lot of admiration for him, what he does is he almost, I mean, we anthropologists can do this sort of holistic class analysis on a village level, right? Or perhaps on a provincial city level, which is what I have always been doing. But Gábor devises a strategy to do this actually on a national level. I don't know anybody who has ever been able to do that, but he does it. And he does it in the same way as we in anthropologists do it, partly. That is, building it up from all these qualitative interviews, I think 62 or so that he was talking about, in provincial industrial cities about deindustrialization, health, sheer panic, depression, and then the rise of illiberal sensibilities. Cities that now, he shows in the book, are basically taken by Jobbik against Fidesz, right? And in a sort of very perverted alliance with big city liberalism. That's the anthropological part. But then he moves up to the national level. He shows how the national bourgeoisie emerges. That is a fantastic chapter. I haven't seen that sort of chapters in any sort of ethnographic work. I think this is a fantastic methodology. It's a simple but very important methodological innovation. So it enriches the pictures enormously at the same time that you have this neo-nationalism emerging as a backlash, as a Polanyian backlash among the deindustrialized working classes. You get this neo-nationalist domestic bourgeoisie getting a big mouth and claiming a role for itself. And the two strengthen each other. And then, of course, in the next phase, the working class vote is hijacked. And what they only get back is a symbolism that salvages their soul, that tells them that they're fantastic Hungarians, but that keeps exploiting them on behalf of the national bourgeoisie, right? And so the new politics is really about, the new left-wing politics must be really about how can we get those deindustrialized working classes, as well as, of course, the younger, more urban working classes, more cosmopolitan working classes, out of the Jobbik and the liberal framework, and realign around a new political, economic, cultural agenda. Now, and then, of course, he looks at this accumulative state as the third element in my counting here now of his narrative, where, as Christina said, he goes point by point. He shows exactly how Hungary is going down, how people are being exploited, how education is being depleted. Hungary must be the only state in Europe where education is systematically shot in the foot, right? That is fantastic. And so a regime that can sell this as developmental is pretty ridiculous. How can they do it? Same for health. Now, all of that is extremely strong. As I said, it is almost, with some methodological innovations, an ethnography on the national level, which enables him to bring class back in terms of politics, in terms of analysis. Now, I have a little point about the accumulative state. And we had a longer discussion, Gábor and I think, over the email about this some time ago. I am more convinced than I was about the concept. Yes, so Gábor takes it from, I can't remember the author now, late 70s. And so he takes it from the rise of the capitalist state in 16th, 17th, 18th century, which has been called the accumulative state. And in that work, the rise of capitalism has been strongly explained by the rise of the accumulative state. I think that is a good move. I'm partly behind that. The accumulative state enables a national bourgeoisie, well, in the case of Western Europe in the 16th, 17th century, to become completely transnational, right? Because it enables the national bourgeoisie to become an imperial class and do dispossession at home and genocide and dispossession abroad. That is the problem, I think, with the accumulative state term. While it is good that you put your finger on the fact that you have a state here that is enabling a national bourgeoisie to accumulate, the original accumulative state in Western Europe was an imperialist state that allowed massive, violent accumulation worldwide. And that is precisely the difference with Hungary. Hungary has no chance to pick a chunk of Africa and do the same. At this point in time. It could have done earlier, but it failed. Now, so for me, that accumulative state is a little bit drawn too far out of its historical context. And I'm going to make a sort of provocative suggestion here. Given that, as you show, the accumulative state and the national bourgeoisie that carries that accumulative state and is the major beneficient of it, is a national bourgeoisie that is heavily invested in two things. I know what. That's the construction sector and its finance. We know that the construction sector works for about 50% on EU subsidies. That's perhaps a misstatement that I'm doing now. But 50% of the investments that the Hungarians, that Orban is making into the national economy come from EU subsidies. So I assume that a lot of that goes to the construction sector. Now, on the one hand, you have this subsidy flow going, which of course the original accumulative states in the West in the 16th, 17th century didn't have. right? They had their subsidies by plundering the rest of the world. Hungary got its subsidies liberally, with a smile, from the EU. That's one part of the equation. The other part is, as you show, very simple, what David Harvey has called dispossession. Selling out of industry, turning into rentier real estate, financialized urban accumulation, pushing down the rights in education, in social reproduction, in health, right? So Harvey's little book, 2003, on the new imperialism, explains very nicely all these aspects, and he calls it accumulation by dispossession. So perhaps instead of the accumulated state, you might want, which is also a very general concept, whereas you're actually talking about Hungary in particular. I mean, is Poland an accumulated state? Perhaps yes, but it is much less repressive of working class interests, as you also show, than Hungary is. Why don't you call this particular ensemble? Why don't you call it subsidized dispossession? And I will leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much, Don, for all those points. Gábor will get a chance to respond to all of these later, but before that, I'd like to pass on the word to Dorottya Sikra. Now, the concept of class has been mentioned over and over again, and you're somebody who studies social policy, which is quite obviously related to class. You were studying this during the previous governments, and you are studying this during the Orbán governments. How do you see Gábor's book from the point of view of someone who studies social processes, social policy as run by the state, and the processes of social mobility, the chances of social mobility for various groups in Hungary? Over to you, Dorottya.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I must admit that I was invited to this panel in November, and then I forgot about it. And like 2 weeks ago, Gábor told us that we should really prepare, and asked us whether we would really make it to the panel. So I woke up, got hold of the book. So I spent my last weeks with Gábor Scheiring's book, and I have to say that I'm truly amazed. I was really, really impressed. Having read the Hungarian version, this English book is now boosted, especially the introduction, and the final chapter was something that brought a lot of theoretical novelty into it, and I enjoyed the whole book, but especially those introductory and the final parts. I think that this is currently probably the most concise and nuanced book about the political economy of illiberalism, not only Hungary, but beyond. So I really thank you for organizing this event and congratulate Gábor for writing this book. So my comments that will follow are footnotes to the book, questions that we may consider and that Gábor also may consider when further working on this regime. And especially, of course, I have to say that I have not really seen any work like that, just like Don was saying, that someone combining economic analysis with sociological investigation, sociological and anthropological investigation, and at the same time political analysis. So I mean, it really is a peculiar combination with really a plethora of knowledge. I mean, okay, but I stop praising you at this point. So some critical remarks and thoughts. I think that there is, the only thing that bothered me in the book was that there were so many phrases to describe the regime, including, of course, most of all, the accumulative state, and then authoritarian neoliberalism, and then the illiberal regime and illiberal right, and of course, the authoritarian capitalism. So I have the impression that we are not yet there. We do not really know how to name this regime. We are probably too close to it, even though we are, over a decade. Still, and I have to quote Orban here, this is a new animal, a new kind of animal, and we really are struggling with grasping it and with defining it. And then in terms of the welfare part, a welfare state part of this new regime, we are not too much closer to define what we see. But maybe I would start with what happened before Orban, when Gábor is contesting the concept of Kornai about the premature welfare state. Quite rightly, I would agree. But then he says that he would call the pre-Orban period a vestigial welfare state. I have to admit, I had to Google this term because it was new for me. But I didn't really, well, I don't really like this term on the one hand, because if you want to talk about something not encompassing and leaving people behind, which I suppose vestigial would mean, then we do have terms for that in welfare state studies. For instance, the very roots of typologies, welfare state typologies by Titmus, he did call it residual welfare state, right? As opposed to an institutionalized institutional welfare state. So if we have words for things, and then why complicate the already very complicated situation or analysis with a new term? But in terms of content, I would also say that what we had before Orban was not really vestigial, and this is, but rather, in many respects, a rather encompassing welfare state, which, of course, we social policy scholars always contested and thought that it was not enough. But looking back from now and looking at comparative data, and now I'm quoting two scholars not from the region, Kati Kuito from Finland or Serena Romano from Italy. Both of them in their books about the region conclude that the Hungarian welfare state was actually leading, not only in the region, but definitely in the region, in terms of preventing poverty, especially child poverty, through the means of universal family allowance, for instance, and many other means. So I would say that although critically looking at this period, and of course, especially the dismantling of unemployment insurance, which you rightly point out, it's maybe too much to say that it was a vestigial or residual welfare state to start with. But the second term of Gyurcsány, when he indeed made a U-turn in terms of welfare policies, and he and not Orban initiated an overarching public works program, and also at the same time a privatization of the healthcare system, did, I think, play an important role in Orban's opportunity to initiate a social, what was social referenda, right? So the social referenda was very important, I would say, in positioning Orban in a like a savior of Hungarians in terms of welfare. And we have to add then their promise to restore cuts in family policies, cuts that were done under the crisis by Bajnai. And they did live up to their promises in these terms. And actually looking into other illiberal countries, including Turkey or Poland, we see these points where right-wing conservative actors appear, and they promise social welfare, like welfare to the people, and they do live up to their promises in their initial first year, or even maybe even later. But of course, you are also very right to point out that the new welfare state Orban is building is a polarizing one. And we probably would agree that social policies of previous governments lacked a concise paradigm behind them, whereas Orban did offer a new paradigm, and his government has been sticking to it no matter what the economic circumstances, and that is the welfare state, to provide welfare to those who are hardworking and to people who have a gainful employment on the primary labor market, and at the same time to if not diminish, but to decrease any benefits and any handouts to those who don't. And even in very extreme circumstances, like the aftermath of the previous crisis and today under the COVID crisis, they do not change policies in these terms. They stick to it, and as in contrast to basically all other European countries, and even not only European countries, they did not initiate any social assistance to those people who lost their jobs under COVID, or any universal benefits or helicopter money that was given by Trump and others. So indeed, they do insist on this paradigm. Now a question. You're saying that the accumulative state and this strategy that I was also describing now, to feed the middle and upper classes and at the same time go against the will of the masses, you're saying that these policies actually hurt the majority, including the working class. Now, I asked my dear colleague Ákos Huszár to share with me one of his graphs that we have been discussing here in the Institute many times, because we are so astonished about it. So the question is whether Orban really did hurt the working class. And I'm sharing the screen now for a moment with you. this graph, this one. What you see here is a comparison. I don't know if you're seeing it really. A comparison of the subsistence level, that is the blue line, with the minimum wage, and then that is the orange line, and then third, the public employment wage. And what you see is that the minimum wage substantially increased by the Orban government, especially since 2016. And this is again pointed out by Gábor in his book. Actually went close to and even surpassed, probably in the first time of post-socialist history of Hungary, the subsistence level of workers. So this means, and I thank then Ákos for sharing this with me. Okay, so then this means that workers on the minimum wage are better off. It's not only the middle and upper classes who are better off, but also the working classes in this sense. And what is more, there are many benefits that are linked to the minimum wage or to wages, including many family policy benefits that were upgraded accordingly, like for instance, the parental leave. And with the expansion of employment that you also analyze in detail, many more people, including women, got hold of these earnings-related benefits as opposed to the universal benefits or the social assistance benefits. So even in terms of welfare, there are masses who gained, I would say. And this is also true for old age benefits, old age pensions, that also grew substantially. And at the same time, you're right, inequalities are growing, and there is a segment of the society that is losing out, that you have seen in the wage for the public workers, that is, losing out, and the gap is opening up. And we have to add now the masses who do not even gain public employment. Now, I think the big question is, what COVID crisis does to all this when of course, the increase in employment is stopped, and masses of unemployed just cannot find jobs because there isn't any, and the state does not do anything to the unemployed. So this is where I stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorottya. Very, very enlightening, especially the graph that you showed and the discussion around it, but also the other points as well that you made previously. Now, first of all, I'd like to encourage people in the audience to send us questions. Some of you have already done that, so you can write that in the chat box at the bottom. If you'd like to ask a question directly, you go to the participants box and you put your little hand up in the participants box. So while we wait for these questions in both formats, I'll give the word back to Gábor briefly. Now you only get a couple of minutes, unfortunately, because we have to leave time for the audience as well. But you have a lot of questions for those few minutes, mostly of terminological nature. You have to deal with issues such as why the accumulative state, why not subsidized dispossession, the illiberal state, the accumulative state, authoritarian state, the vestigial versus residual welfare state. So many terminological issues have been raised. I'd like you to address these in the impossible task of doing so in only about 3 minutes. Yeah. So with that, over to you, Gábor. Good luck.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the time that you took to engage with the book, and thank you very much for the amazing comments and constructive criticism. It really helps in my future research. Obviously, I cannot respond in any meaningful way to all the comments, but I have all these notes, so it's really working, and we'll make. I will think them through in the near future. Just a few things. Christina mentioned the concept, just to increase the number of concepts. The concept of middle income trap, and as far as I remember, I wasn't using it in the book, but since then I have been using it thoroughly, because it's a concept that really captures really well one of the key problems of Hungary, both before and after 2010, and that literature has also insights into how states, successful social developmental states, can manage this kind of economic dependency and middle income trap. So thank you for the term. The second is subsidized dispossession versus the accumulative state. So first of all, the accumulative state has the purpose to distinguish the state from two other forms that are proposed as explanations. One is that it's a developmental state, and people around Viktor Orbán, but also some other, like Peter Bilkin and some others, have proposed that it's a developmental state, that it's emerging in Hungary. And I think it's highly misleading. So we need another world. And the second is that it's also not a mafia state. So it's not just about corruption. It's not just about the enrichment of a very small group of people. And the third point is that it links, the idea of the accumulative state links the underlying processes to accumulation, and right to the very core of capitalism. And yes, this has been taking place in other countries, and repression of democracy, repression of trade unions until the end of the 19th century was crucial for the success of capitalism in the West. But of course, there are also many differences. One might argue about the micro-imperialism that is taking place under Orbán, Hungarian transnationals buying up companies in the region, but it's definitely not comparable to imperialism of the West. And I agree with Dorothy that probably I was using too many concepts, and this certainly reflects the nature of the work. It's a cultural, political, economic analysis of Hungary, and of course there's other work being done in that dimension, but we're really treading new ground here, and so we need much more work to see clearly, and especially in terms of comparisons. One of the papers that I'm working on now is comparing Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic in terms of the nature of the economic response of populists. And I don't have the time to go into the details, but that also helps me to pin down better what concepts are useful and what concepts are not. The vestigial welfare state certainly does not position the book in relation to the welfare policy literature well enough. But this wasn't the intention. Here again, the intention was to contrast it to the idea of the premature welfare state, and to suggest that it was well developed in some ways, but it was not working well enough. And I don't have enough time, but I give all kinds of data to show in what way I don't think it was working well enough, and was not investing enough, especially in those capacities that would be required for long-term knowledge-intensive human development-oriented economists. And I agree with you that these processes have been especially problematic in the second half of the 2000s. This is when sort of avant-garde neoliberalism was revived again under Gábor Scheiring and caused all kinds of political problems. And we could have another discussion about the nature of welfare and social policy under Orbán, and I'm certainly not as much of an expert on this as you, but I also have one graph to show you in defense of the book. And again, I'd just like to point out that there's a fundamental difference between absolute and relative losers. So we're talking about a period when whole Eastern Europe was growing rapidly. The whole global economy was growing quite rapidly after 2012. And everyone was winning. And this was one of the first periods when workers were also winning by the position of this particular segment of Europe in European value chains. So that's important to see that it has a lot to do with global economic processes and the role of Europe's eastern periphery as a manufacturing base for Western corporations, and the desire of Western corporations to relocate production to the region. Having said that, what I think I'd like to highlight in the book and also now is what the government's preferences are and who the relative winners and losers are. And there I think the picture is quite clear. And you're right, that one distinction that they are operating with is between the idle and the worker. So we have a workfare state, but we also have a very clear class division between lower and upper classes. So I think the lower down you go in the working class, the less they are benefiting, as opposed to upper segments of the working class and upper middle class. And then the most who are benefiting the most, they are the economic elites. And if you look at the way Orbán restructured social policies, A, huge divestment in social investment under Orbán, B, there was a very clear and almost linear upward redistribution of social spending. I also try to share my screen. I hope you can see this now. This is from the book, from the English version of the book, which shows all the social income support that the state maintains has dramatically declined for the lower strata and has basically dramatically increased for the higher strata. And it's not completely linear, but it's almost linear. So the more down you go, the more you lose. And the upper you go, the more you gain. So that's the way Orbán operates his redistributive apparatus, basically taking money away from the poor and giving it to the rich to simplify. But of course, it's much more complex than that. And I hope we'll have the time to get into the details, because A, the global economic processes matter. And Orbán also knows that he has to construct an electoral majority. And his way of doing this is also relying on certain social and economic policies that indeed are designed to, to make the victims of his regime happier. And these social and economic policies in some dimensions go beyond the pre-2010 neoliberalism. Like, for example, I think public works is a very, very important example. It's a regressive conservative social policy, but it's much more for those people living in deep poverty, left behind areas. It's much more than just saying, here's the market will solve your problems. You need better education. We might need to lower the minimum income, the minimum wage, because you're not productive enough. And then you will find solution on the market. So that was the liberal narrative. And Orbán says, no, I'm the state, I will save you from the deepest poverty. And it's an increase in state intervention for these areas. But again, relatively speaking, these people are losing out, but still they are one of the most important supporter base of Orbán. I briefly hint to this in the book, how it's also combined with political paternalism and hierarchical management of these people. So it's a really clever strategy designed to redistribute some income to these people on public works, but also to control them politically by empowering the mayors in these areas. And but of course, I don't have the time to elaborate with this. We are doing this with my friend Christoph Szombathy, who has done amazing work in rural Hungary, and we've written a separate article just on this kind of embedding, illiberal embedding of neoliberalism under Orbán. So it's about relative and absolute winners. And in absolute terms, you're right that broad segments have been winning, and Orbán is designing some social policies to prevent a revolt. But it's very clear in relative terms that the higher you go in income distribution, the more people win, and the lower you go, the more people lose, because of a very intentional upward redistributive regime under Viktor Orbán.
Okay, Gábor, thank you very much. I think you've done the impossible job of giving some meaningful answers to all of these.
It was a bit longer than 3 minutes, though.
It took longer, but at least you did address the major points, I think, that the other panelists raised. But now we do have to go over to the audience. I'd once again like to encourage anyone listening to us to send us questions either through the chat box in a written form, or if you're brave enough, you can put your hand up through the participants panel and you can ask the questions directly. While you're thinking or while you're gathering your courage, I'll read the 3 questions that have already come in. First one is from Andre Goodfriend. He's asking about the euro. Is the adoption of euro able to mitigate nationalism, in your opinion? What lies behind the non-adoption of the euro in Hungary? So that's the first question from Andre Goodfriend. The second one is from Ács Péterné. It's a very short question, but very to the point. Are we talking about a working class or a precariat? Which of the two is the more precise wording? Working class or precariat? This is from Ács Péterné. And the third one is from Székely Anna. She's asking, what is the way out of here? And what other readings would you recommend in this matter? So I guess this is to all of you, obviously primarily to Gábor, but if any of the other panelists have a response, they're also welcome to respond. And I'd once again like to encourage all the others in the audience to send us questions. Who would like to start responding to these questions? Gábor, do you want to go first as the author?
Okay, thank you very much for these questions. So the question of the euro, I have a double answer, but overall, I don't think that the euro is the most efficient solution to nationalism. However, I do think that it might also have some positive effects in terms of its symbolic value and in terms of resonating with Hungarians' deep desire to integrate into the European economy and into the European civilization. And certainly being part of this imagined community would make it harder to play with the nationalist card in terms of symbolic politics. But I do fear that in itself, the introduction of the euro would make some of the underlying social and economic tensions worse than they are, and would make it more difficult in some ways. At least that's the past experience from other European countries. Would make it difficult to converge and to European average, and to decrease the gap between Europe's periphery and the core. And there's a huge literature on this. Mostly interestingly, American economists tend to be more critical than European ones of the monetary construction of the Eurozone. And we don't have the time to get into the reasons why, but the bottom line is that in some ways it would help, certainly it strengthen this European identity, but I fear that the social and economic costs might overwhelm the positive effects on identity politics, especially if not managed well by a local developmental state. And introducing the euro would definitely just make it even more difficult to do this, and would risk Hungary being chained to this middle income trapped in the middle income trap for a longer time than necessary. So that's my double-edged answer. Working class or precariat. I'm talking about both in the book. What I think is crucial for Orbán is especially, or has been, is the working class. Because it played a crucial role historically in the political success of the left, and also in the 90s, early 2000s until 2002, regional strongholds of the left were built on the working class electorate. And this has collapsed for various reasons: social tensions rising, and the deafness of the left to the growing economic anger among workers. So that's, I think, crucial to see. But there's also there has been a growing precariat, and I hint at this in the book, how Orbán is using creating new hierarchies and distinguishing between what some might call lower middle class, I might call the working class, from the precariat. And by deploying these moral hierarchies, Orbán makes it very, very difficult to create a political or social coalition between these different strata. So I think we're talking about both, and I'm certainly talking about both in the book. And what is the way out is always the most difficult question, especially to answer in 1 minute. But I definitely do think that politics plays a role, and one of the crucial tasks for the opposition in Hungary, I think, is to understand how we got here with better political economic analysis, and learning the lessons would also mean that the opposition recognizes the need to build a social coalition with those workers who used to function as the regional backbones of the left in Hungary. So that's I think crucial. The other is that there's a need to break Orbán's monopoly over any kind of economic patriotism, and to embrace the state as a developmental tool. Some liberal economists are learning that this is doable and indeed important for a successful economic policy, but doing it in a clever way, I think, should be important for the left as well. A socially and democratically viable developmental state that reduces the tensions between transnational and domestic capital. So these are the two big policy lessons and political lessons that we could draw from the book. It's certainly very, very difficult, but also I think because Orbán's regime is so highly polarizing, by 2018, Hungary became the most unequal country in the Visegrad region, again, as a result of these upward redistributive policies. So there's a chance to organize the victims, but it's also difficult because of these very clever policies and politics designed to alienate different segments of different victims from each other. But I definitely do believe there's hope, but progressives really need to learn to navigate these structural circumstances, understand their importance, and navigate these structural circumstances well.
Thank you, Gábor. Dawn, I saw your hand going up. if you would respond briefly. There are other people waiting to ask questions, but it's over to Don now. You're muted, Don. You need to unmute yourself.
I do that.
Yep. You've done it.
Okay, very sorry. I'll be very quick. About the euro. We cannot give a universal answer to that because the euro is different in different periods, right? So the euro, after the financial crisis, led to internal deflation in Greece, Italy, Portugal, all those who were in the euro, and France, and that actually stimulated the rise of liberal politics. Salvini is the symbol here, enormously, right? So in particular context and with particular policies around the euro is a liberal tool. It produces illiberalism, and it has done that. It has done that in the relationship to Hungary too. It's not just a domestic development. It's important to see that. The euro at this point in time, with the new funds coming over, which is basically just quantitative easing in many ways, is a very different story. So this particular euro that we're having now, as you see also now, what's actually going on in Italy is important for you. So Draghi coming in as a sort of gold standard for handling the euro funds that are being transferred to Italy is actually crushing Salvini, right? And similar things can happen in France. So that is what I would say about the euro and nationalism and identification with the euro project. Just one quick thing about precariat and working class. Look, these are completely different vocabularies, right? Many in the working class can be precarious. So the working class is not necessarily working, nor is it necessarily blue collar. It's very important to see that. I'm doing research among people, among the IT proletariat in Cluj at the moment in Romania. They all imagine that they are middle class, and not just middle class, rising middle class. And they are about, they're among many of them are among the 10% richest of the country, but they are working class. And if the industry moves out, which is very possible next year, the year after, they will be incredibly precarious. So, we must update those concepts all the time in relationship to how capitalism actually works and the class structurations and the value equations that are happening within that. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Don. Now we have two people asking questions directly. There are a couple of people who have written, which I'll read later, but there's actually more than two people. Yes, there's three people. There's József Veres, and then David Ost, and Anna-Lívia Székely. So let's have these three questions now. We'll give the floor first to József Veres, please. Turn on your microphone, please, and ask the question directly.
I hope you can hear me now. So the first is more a kind of remark. Upon my understanding, the education, the healthcare, and the massive non-inclusion of the Roma are the three original sins of the Orban era, or if you want, the Orban period. This was started already before that, but it became the massive policy under this last 10 years. The second issue is that we have a kind of special way of second enclosure in Hungary, which was very well explained by the author. And I am afraid that this is just the more brutal way of a process which is ongoing globally. So this second enclosure, it's not only for the for the understanding how we can take away the knowledge workers' ownership, but this is also happening with the turning people into the precariat, while still they have the feeling that they have a hope to raise themselves to the middle class. And what is very important in Hungary, that it's extremely politicized and it's very carefully measured permanently, having this strategy to creating the so-called new middle class, which in fact is just the cohort which will support Orban. And as it was discussed already, in the meantime, they are rebalancing the voting basis from the real middle class to the most poor part of the country in the rural area, who are very well grabbed by the public work and that kind of very effective tools related to the economy, but in fact, they are non-economical tools. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Over to David Ost. Can we please give the microphone over to David Ost? David, can you?
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It was really a great panel, and you know, this work is so interesting. But I want to push just a little bit more on this question of working class support or not for Orban and Fidesz. You know, both Dorothea and Gábor present economic evidence through their graphs on whether workers benefit or not. You know, but of course, those are statistics, rather marginal. I mean, which wouldn't affect working class support one way or the other. You know, what is the Orban strategy for maintaining working class support while introducing a workfare state that, as everyone says, chiefly benefits the middle class? Now, maybe it's something Dorothea said, which we kind of see in Poland as well, that at first upon coming to power, they focused more on some social issues and made some benefits. And so maybe they count on the fact that, you know, they keep mentioning that we did this in the past, and so we represent you, but they seem to have moved very far away from that towards this middle-class welfare state. So I wonder, you know, what's their rhetoric on the issue, right? Do they claim to support workers, but not trade unions, right? As far as I know, they have very little or virtually no trade union support. You know, and Gábor talks about, right, the continuing working class anger, but Orban doesn't seem to be losing support from this, or is he? And finally, just, you know, a quick question, though I'm sure it's not a quick answer, but, you know, what role nowadays does persecution or discrimination of Roma have today in buttressing Orban support? That seemed to be a big issue for Fidesz once, of course, for Jobbik. You know, does this still enjoy widespread support? And I understand that has something to do with public employment, public works, that Roma are largely employed there. But if you could say something about that too. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions there. Since this is the last round, we're running out of time. I'll have to read the questions that were sent to us in a written form. One of them is from Juhász Borbála. I'd like to ask the author if he has done any gender budgeting of the numbers. Is there any difference between the gains and the losses of women and men in Hungary? Same question is for family budgeting. Any differences between gains and losses between people without children and those with children? And finally, I'll ask a question from David Elam. Slavoj Žižek has said that the greatest irony of Europe is that in Eastern Europe, the ex-communists are now the best capitalists. Similar processes of unequal tax burden are present in Western Europe. Is the problem with authoritarian capitalism in Orban's case then a normative question? Are they so successful because they cannot be held to democratic morals, such as the sanctity of service in elected office, despite overseeing a similar growth of inequality as in the UK? A lot of long questions, a lot of complicated questions, very little time. So I'd like to encourage you to answer these questions as brief as you can. Obviously, once again, I'm asking the impossible. While Gábor is thinking, let's start with Dorothea now, who's raised her hand. It gives Gábor a time to think these over. Dorothea, over to you.
I would like to briefly comment on David Ost's question. Very good one, actually. Whether Orban is still focusing on the working class or not. Well, looking into the narratives, what I presented was, you know, the impact of raising the official minimum wage. substantially. But what we see in discourses is that the last time the hardworking man was in focus in Orban's discourse was 2014. And in 2015, governmental discourse shifted to the anti-immigrant propaganda, and that was, that swiped everything and anything else off. And at the same time, they also invented, well, family policy has been important throughout, but since about 2015 and 16, and especially 17 maybe, the family became like the positive antithesis of immigration. Family and then demography became like the positive answer to the nasty immigration crisis. This is what this is in terms of discourse. Now, when they present families visually, and also in the speeches of the Prime Minister and other leading politicians, they always depict family with at least one working adult, but mainly actually two. So that involves also female or mothers' participation in the labor market that has been fostered by the Orban government. So it is the working parents, the working family that is promoted in, well, not only in terms of rhetorics, but also in terms of taxation and the new programs, new housing programs, new kinds of benefits. So it is not the worker per se, but it is the working family that is in the focus now.
Thank you, Dorottya. Gábor or Don or Christina, any of you? We have to be brief. We're out of time.
I have a couple of comments. I'll be quick. First of all, I think second enclosure is a great term, and it resonates well with Don's proposal of the dispossession, subsidized dispossession, and it resonates with what I'm describing in a book about how the state facilitates the creation of a new bourgeoisie, in part by subsidizing the upper middle class, in part by facilitating the enrichment of the existing economic elite. To David Osk's question, again, this could be just a topic for a separate panel, the relationship between Eastern European illiberals and workers. One of the things I'd like to point out is that it's also a changing relationship. So it has been, working class support has been crucial in 2010 in particular. It's also important after that, since then, but definitely the share of workers, I haven't seen research, but I think overall it has decreased compared to 2010. And one of the things that we have to take into consideration is that in 2014, Viktor Orbán and his party received less votes than they did in 2006 when they lost the elections. So this was 2014. Then in 2018, they launched a new strategy combining migration and with also other policies, and also we have to take into consideration the upward cycle of the global economy, which allowed them again to gain a two-thirds majority. But at the background, there was also already a structural change taking place in the electoral coalition that Viktor Orbán was building on, the declining weight of urban workers, and more emphasis on villages and lower classes especially. And related to this is also the fact that there's a huge governmental propaganda about wages, and the increase of minimum wage is in part related to that, which is I think important also compared to the performance of previous left-wing governments. Orbán is usually doing better in terms of the minimum wage. But again, if you look at real wage growth overall in the region, Hungary's real wage growth between 2010 and 18 has been below that of Poland and the Czech Republic. So Orbán is playing a very clever game in terms of utilizing this upward cycle of the global economy to maintain his support also among workers as much as possible, but still the support is declining, and just cultural framing and migration won't be enough, especially under the Corona crisis. We see that he's continuing with the same upwards redistributive policies, and the popularity of the government has declined again, and it's a big part of the electorate that is supporting Orbán, but it's not impossible to beat Orbán. So it's not extremely overarchingly popular, and in part because of his policies are not overarchingly popular in each segments of society. So it's possible to create a winning coalition against Orbán, and in part that has to attract a part of working class voters. I haven't looked in depth in the gendered effect of redistribution under Orbán, but we know that there's a retraditionalization of the division of labor, at least in governmental preferences, and also as Dorothy pointed out, a particular focus on a particular type of family. I would say definitely employed, but also sort of a middle-class family that is particularly valued under Viktor Orbán. But I haven't looked at the financial impact across genders in detail of Orbán's policies. And finally, I'm really grateful for the question about comparing Hungary, for example, to the UK, and this gives me again the opportunity to say that Hungary is not that exceptional. And it's very important to see that, in his home country, when neoliberalism was first rolled out in the UK, it was embedded in what Stuart Hall has called authoritarian populism. So creating the same kinds of hierarchies, distinguishing hardworking citizens from idle citizens, distinguishing parts of the working class from the precariat, distinguishing upper middle class from lower middle class. These hierarchies and the moral panics designed to maintain and strengthen these hierarchies were crucial for neoliberalism's success, which was also like upward redistributive policy. So it's not at all new in terms, in this sense, what is taking place in Hungary. You could observe the same moral hierarchies being created in the US in the 80s under early years of neoliberalism. What I would say is different is how avant-garde neoliberalism was in the 90s and 2000s in Hungary, and this created a bigger backlash as opposed to compared to most Western countries, certainly Western European countries. So you have more kind of a difference in terms of extent. And you have also a difference in terms of extent, in a sense, how far Orbán is willing to go supporting embourgeoisement and supporting capital accumulation, which I think is part of the reason why he needs, tilting the political playing field and curtailing democracy. But I wouldn't say it's a qualitative difference, but it's more like it's a quantitative difference. So it's a way Orbán manages capitalism. It's not that he's completely inventing something new. He's inventing partly new solutions to existing problems, but that also these solutions mimic existing solutions to capitalist tensions in other parts of the world.
Okay, Gábor, thank you very much. Our time is up, unfortunately. It's always the terrible job of the moderator to put an end to a discussion. At some point you have to do it. I know this discussion is just getting exciting, and there would be a lot more to say, but I'm sure Gábor is available for comments and questions. So if there's anything that we haven't been able to cover, you can always approach him. He's a very approachable person. Write to him and he'll answer you, and you can continue the discussion in a written form. Now I'd like to close this session off by thanking a lot of people for making this happen. Primarily, of course, Gábor Scheiring, who has written this book and has been willing to come and talk to us about it. Thank you very much, Gábor, and congratulations in the name of all of us and the audience as well. Thank you. I'd also like to thank those 3 panelists who have joined us from all over Europe, actually. Kristina Schörek from Malaga in Spain, Don Kalb from Bergen in Norway, and Sikra Dorottya somewhere in Hungary, I suppose. Thank you very much, all 3 of you, for having joined us in this great discussion tonight. I'd also like to obviously thank the audience, all of you who have come and joined us. We will continue with these events. This is a series of about 6 events. So there will be other speakers in the same topic or similar topics coming up in the near future. So please come again. I'd also like to thank Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for the cooperation, especially Jürgen János. I'd like to thank the interpreters, Daniel and Otto, for doing a fantastic job of covering this for those people who were listening to the discussion in Hungarian. I'd like to thank András for the technical coordination of the entire event, and I'd like to thank Peter for organizing the event. I hope I haven't left out anybody. I enjoyed this. Thank you again, Gábor. Thank you, all of you. See you next time. Stay healthy, stay safe. Bye-bye.